Florida water, or agua de Florida, my Spanish is terrible, is a natural cologne manufactured since the early 19th century. It has a light citrus smell with a hint of cinnamon. It's a perfectly serviceable cologne. But if you've heard of Florida water at all, it's probably not through the fragrance industry. You've heard of Florida water because Florida water is widely used in folk magic traditions like hoodoo, and also widely used in Afro-Caribbean religions like voodoo and Santeria, and more relevant to this story, Kardecian spiritism, which, when practiced in the Caribbean and Latin America, incorporates aspects of African, especially Yoruba, beliefs and practices, as well as Native American, especially Taino, beliefs and practices. Look, I usually take some time in July for personal spiritual development, and since I practice spiritism, among other things, I wanted to get in touch with the traditions of my Caribbean co-religionists, or espiritismo in Spanish. So I wanted to test the powers of Florida water for myself. And folks, Florida water kicks ass. It's tremendous for spiritual cleansing and as an offering, and I've taken it to wearing it now as my regular cologne. I decided to reach out to my local communities of Santeros and Puerto Rican espirititos for help in constructing a Boveda ancestor altar to take my spiritist practice further. There are plenty of instructions online for building one, but I wanted to reach out for two reasons. The first was conflicting sources about whether I needed some form of initiation to use a Boveda altar. Now, not as somebody who's completely new to the religion, mind you, but as somebody who already practiced the European branch of the religion. It's a common rule of the spirit world never to reach above your initiatory grade. The general consensus of those I consulted was no, I didn't need additional initiation. The second reason for reaching out was to avoid cultural appropriation. Now, I know everybody's sphincters just tightened there, but by cultural appropriation, I mean an offensive use of another culture. Look, I'm a pasty Mick engaging in a practice of mostly Afro-Caribbean folks, so I wanted to get it right. I think intersectionality is bullshit, so yeah, I totally think European cultures can definitely be appropriated. But it got me thinking how much of ritual belongs to culture and how much belongs to the world. I went looking for what other people thought, and oh boy, there is so much stupid surrounding this topic it makes me lose faith in humanity. Or at least it would, if I had any to begin with. But first I need to clarify something. Wicca has always had a reputation among occultists for being silly. Like, OG Gardnerian Wicca was basically a ripoff of Aleister Crowley and the Golden Dawn, with some pseudo-history thrown in, while, 90s and early 2000s Wicca that I grew up with typically involved a misunderstanding of Celtic culture, which, yes, we'll get back to that in a minute. But the Wicca of the early 2020s, the so-called witchtock generation, also dubbed Neo-Wicca or New Wicca, which is what I'm going to call it going forward, is a convoluted mess of intersectional feminism, bourgeois cultural posturing, and a random grab bag of half-understood, New Age fluff bunny bullshit. Does New Wicca engage in cultural appropriation? Absolutely. But it's the response to the accusations of cultural appropriation in the witchtock community that is truly insane.
Am I doing anything that's racially insensitive? Am I doing something that is colonialism, essentially? Stop trying to force your way into spaces that are not for you.
A thought experiment might be helpful here. Suppose indigenous botanical knowledge is used to create a powerful medication by Western pharmacologists. In this case, while I agree that acknowledgement and perhaps royalties should be paid to that indigenous culture, is it cultural appropriation to take that medicine? Probably not. But if you did think it were cultural appropriation, would changing the name make a meaningful difference? I don't really think so. So let's start where this conversation usually starts. White sage. White sage is used to spiritually purify spaces and people, and the popularity of white sage has led to over-harvesting, which is a completely valid concern, but white sage purification, or smudging, is also sacred to several Native American tribes. Now, is burning white sage cultural appropriation? like the medicine example, I don't think so. I believe white sage works, and compared to other herbs, even to common sage, white sage is simply the most powerful, purely cleansing smoke out there. There are other powerful cleansing smokes like frankincense and Palo Santo, but those are more for the invocation of celestial spirits. If you think white sage smoke is just cultural and has no real power, okay, fine, but then what are you doing here, and why are you a Wiccan? And do you think, changing the name from smudging to, quote, smoke purification or some such other nonsense really lessens the impact of the alleged cultural appropriation you think exists? And generally, that's the undercurrent of this discussion, right? The implications that the supposed appropriated practices are just powerless cultural artifice, which strikes me as more insulting to these cultures than the realist interpretation. But it gets worse with the discussion of closed practices. There are no closed practices or initiatory practices. There are only closed or initiatory societies. If, for example, the Lakota shamans declare their religion closed to outsiders, they don't have the authority to do that. Only the spirits have that authority. To say otherwise is to deny the spirits of their autonomy. The spirits will work with whom they will, and even if the spirits were to agree to close the tradition, there may be spirits in the pantheon willing to give you backdoor entrance into the system. For example, I'm willing to bet the Lakota demoness Unchehila, I hope I pronounced that remotely correctly, would be able to let me hack the backdoor into the system. And then there's spirit initiation, wherein the spirits convey the initiation and all the privileges associated with that on whom they choose, even when the community refuses initiation. I was spirit initiated into Mormonism's Melchizedek priesthood live during a video last year. But why would the spirits want to close themselves off to sincere devotees, just because those devotees have the wrong ethnic mix? It's in the interest of spirits to increase devotion directed at them. And then there's the issue of spirits bound to the land. So, even if the original people have been displaced, the land spirits still need to be dealt with, and probably in a way developed by the original inhabitants. I live in an area originally occupied by Lenape people. If I encounter, say, a malevolent spirit in the land that was known about in Lenape culture, I may need to learn a Lenape system of exorcism in order to deal with that spirit. But the most infuriating thing has to be New Wicca's misinterpretation of voodoo and other Afro-Caribbean religions. Voodoo is an initiatory tradition both socially and from the spirits. That's not terribly surprising, as most of the Loa either are West African ancestors or have long-standing relationships with West African people. When you get involved with a spirit that has an ancestral tie to you, the relationship is much stronger than a newly forged spiritual relationship. Look, I'm not initiated into voodoo, but I've been involved with parts of voodoo, what some people call black voodoo, for the past 8-ish years. I mostly work with Papa Legba and Mayede, the Loa of death and ancestry, including the great king of the dead Baron Samedi and his gorgeous queen Mama Bridget, who's a white lady by the way. But everybody dies, and Legba is a liminal being, so these Loa rarely require initiation. The key, though, is that I got permission from these spirits to work with them. Mediumship isn't really that big a thing in the Wiccan community, in my experience. Anyway, it's usually the Rada or the Petro who require initiation, though I've worked with the Petro a few times in the past without issue, and even though Rada like Ogun requested initiation the time I tried to work with him, I have worked with Dambala without initiation, the most powerful Rada. There are several more examples of silly I've seen, like arguing only Romani people can read tarot, or that only Indians can talk about chakras, or that black magic is racist. The term comes from necromancy. But I think I've made my point. So let's pull that pin on Celtic culture and talk about actual cultural appropriation in Wicca culture. First, before we leave voodoo, I've seen articles about using the term puppet rather than voodoo doll, even though voodoo dolls themselves are appropriated from voodoo and Fon and Dahomean culture more broadly. Voodoo practitioners usually call them bocho, and they're generally considered the physical embodiment of prayers and intentions. They're not designed to give your boss hemorrhoids if you make a doll that looks like him and stick his ass full of pins. Look, back in the day, in the early 90s and 2000s, Wicca advertised itself as a continuation of Celtic pagan culture, before the popularity of Celtic Reconstructionism sort of took off. As a young ethnic Celt, I was very interested in Wicca for that reason, and most of the Wiccans I knew were also ethnic Celts drawn to the practice for the same reason. And while I quickly realized Wicca largely misunderstands Celtic culture, Wicca has still sort of tied itself to Celtic culture at its core. Wicca uses Irish names for holidays that are still an important part of my ethnic Irish heritage, especially the cross-quarter days, and Irish deities, the Tuatha Danann, are widely venerated in Wicca despite Irish culture still treating these beings as real beings, the Ishi, unlike, say, contemporary Greek culture, which treats the Olympians as, purely mythical beings. And yet, you would probably be called racist and a folkist if you suggested Celtic polytheism is a closed spirituality in the same way and for the same reasons Wiccans would say Lakota religion is a closed spirituality. It's just rank hypocrisy that prioritizes culture over a robust faith in the spirits. New Wicca is utterly unserious fluff. Always remember, the spirits don't obey intersectional feminism. Feel free to call on, for example, the Hopi deities if you're white. They might just answer you. But if they do, and if they demand veneration with white sage, then they will have white sage. That's all for now, folks. Blessed be.